The morning began like any other on Hollywood Boulevard, where the sun didn't simply rise, it performed. Lights spilled across chrome bumpers, cafe windows, and the polished marble of storefronts like a slow curtain lifting on a stage that never truly slept. People moved with purpose and pretense, heels tapping, newspapers tucked under arms, sunglasses masking stories no one asked to hear, and inside the elegant downtown branch of Golden State Trust Bank, the air carried the quiet confidence of money cool, controlled. Perfumed faintly with polish and paper and power, the bank was a place where voices softened the moment people stepped inside, where every footstep echoed just a little longer than necessary, as if reminding visitors that this was not a place for chaos or desperation. Tellers sat behind long counters of dark oak and brass, their uniforms crisp, their smiles trained. This was a building designed to reassure those who had much, and to quietly intimidate those who did not. At precisely 9:17 a.m., the glass doors parted again. The man who stepped in did not fit the rhythm. His coat was old. Not torn, not filthy, just tired. The kind of tired fabric gets when it has lived many lives and learned all of them the hard way. His shoes were clean, but worn thin at the edges. His hair, silvering at the temples, curled softly at his collar, unstyled, unimportant. He paused just inside the entrance, as if the temperature change alone had surprised him, then looked around with slow, careful eyes. Some of the waiting customers noticed him immediately. Not because he was loud, but because he wasn't. He didn't carry the restless impatience of the wealthy or the nervous stiffness of those seeking loans. He simply stood there, breathing, as though this place was not above him or below him, just unfamiliar. The security guard's gaze lifted. First then, one teller glanced up, then another. The man walked toward the counter marked General Services. Each step was unhurried, not defiant, not timid, just deliberate. Behind the counter sat a young teller named Brent Caldwell, 26 years old. Immaculate hair, tailored suit, a smile that came easily to important people and with effort to everyone else. He had been hired less than a year ago, and already he spoke the language of balance. Sheets and private accounts, with the comfort of someone who had never once worried about a meal. His morning had been dull, too dull. Wealthy clients, polite nods, silent transfers of invisible numbers. He was already bored until the man in the old coat stopped in front of him. "Good morning," the man said gently. Brent glanced at him. Then, without meaning to, at the coat. The shoes, the empty hands. "Yes," Brent replied, fingers already hovering over the keyboard, though his eyes betrayed mild annoyance. The line behind the man was beginning to grow. "I'd like to make a deposit," the man said. Brent's gaze flicked down to the counter. "What amount?" he asked. The man reached into his coat pocket. He did not pull out a checkbook, he did not pull out a card. He placed a small cloth pouch on the counter and loosened the drawstring. Inside were coins. Not loose change, but carefully kept. Quarters, dimes, nickels, some old, some new, all clean. All counted, judging by the way. They were stacked in modest little towers. The soft clink of metal seemed louder than it should have been. A woman in line shifted. Someone behind her cleared their throat. Brent blinked once. Then he laughed, not cruelly at first. "More like someone surprised by a joke they thought must be accidental, sir," he said, trying to keep his voice light. "We're a full-service financial institution, not a street donation box." The man did not flinch. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm here." Brent exhaled through his nose, smiling now. "A little wider. We don't usually process." "This," he said, gesturing vaguely at the coins. "Coin machines are across the street." "I don't want a machine," the man replied calmly. "I want to deposit them." "For what account?" Brent asked. "My own." Brent's smile tightened. "And do you have your account number?" The man shook his head once. "Not with me." Brent leaned back slightly in his chair, glancing past the man at the growing line. Then he looked back, eyes sharpening. "Look," he said, lowering his voice just enough to sound reasonable. Banks are for financial transactions. Most people who walk in here deal in assets, investments, capital, not pocket change. The man studied him, not with offense. With something closer to curiosity, "These coins are all I have," he said. Brent laughed again. This time, it carried. A couple people behind the man exchanged looks. "Well," Brent said, unable to resist, "only beggars pay with." Coins. The words landed heavier than he expected. The man did not raise his voice. He did not defend himself. He only closed the pouch slowly and placed his palm over it. "Then perhaps," he said quietly, "you could tell me where beggars are supposed to keep what little they've earned." Brent opened his mouth. Before he could answer, the front doors opened again, and the entire temperature of the room changed. Conversation stalled. Not stopped, stalled, like a record needle lifted mid-song. Two men entered first, both in dark tailored suits. They did not smile. They scanned. Then they stepped aside, and Dean Martin walked in. He did not announce himself. He never had to. He moved with the unhurried ease of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. His coat fit perfectly. Not flashy. Not stiff. His hair was brushed back in that familiar way, silvered now, but still unmistakable. His face carried lines the way old songs carry meaning. Soft, lived in, honest. "Hey," woman gasped. Someone whispered his name without meaning to. A pen fell. Dean Martin's eyes swept the bank, taking it in not as a star might, but as a man might. Then they stopped. On the old coat, on the pouch, on the teller's frozen smile, and finally on the man standing at the counter. Something shifted in his expression, recognition, warmth, and something dangerously close to disappointment. He walked forward. Every step was audible now. When he reached the counter, he did not look at Brent. He stood beside the man in the old coat and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Frank," Dean said softly, using the man's name like a memory. "I was hoping I wasn't too late." The bank had gone utterly silent. The man with the coins closed his eyes. Just once, and in that single breath, the world began to turn. No one in the bank spoke. Not because they had been instructed to be quiet, but because the moment itself had seized the air. Dean Martin's hand rested gently on the old man's shoulder. And somehow, that single, simple gesture carried more authority than any badge, any title, any balance sheet ever could. It wasn't a celebrity entrance. It was a personal one. The kind that rearranged the emotional furniture of a room. Brent's smile had vanished. His mouth was still slightly open, but no words were forming. His mind was racing backward through the last 30 seconds, trying desperately to retrieve the sentence he had just thrown into the world. "Only beggars pay with coins." He watched Dean Martin turn slightly toward the man with the pouch. The warmth in his eyes unmistakable, the familiarity undeniable. This was not a stranger Dean had stepped in to rescue for the cameras. This was someone he knew, someone he respected. Frank, Dean repeated, softer now, as if the name itself carried history. "You still walk into places like this without warning." Frank's lips curved into the smallest smile. "Some habits don't know how to retire." Dean let out a breath that was almost a laugh, almost a sigh. "Neither do some men." The customers who moments earlier had been checking their watches now leaned without realizing it. The tellers who prided themselves on professionalism stood frozen. Even the security guard felt suddenly uncertain of his own importance. Because this wasn't spectacle. It was intimacy. And intimacy commands attention in a way power never can. Dean finally turned his head and looked at the counter, then at Brent. Not sharply. Not angrily, but fully. It was worse than anger. It was assessment. Brent straightened in his chair, color rising into his face. "Mr. Martin," Dean lifted one finger gently, not to silence him, but to slow him. "Before you say anything," he said calmly, "I want to understand what's happening here." Brent swallowed. "This gentleman was attempting to make a deposit," he said. "In coins." "Ah!" Dean nodded once. And I was explaining that we have procedures. That this bank generally handles money? Dean offered quietly. Brent hesitated. Yes. Larger transactions. Dean's eyes drifted down to the small pouch still resting beneath Frank's hand. How much is in there? He asked. Frank loosened the drawstring again, carefully with reverence. Almost, he poured the coins onto the counter. Not in a spill, but in a controlled stream, arranging them instinctively into small, precise lines. The sound this time was different. It wasn't clinking. It was deliberate. Each piece landing as though it mattered. $318, Frank said. And 75 cents? A ripple of surprise moved through the nearby customers. That was not pocket change. Not nothing. Not wealth. But not nothing. And do you know how long it took me to earn that? Frank continued, his voice still quiet, still steady. No one answered. 8 months, he said. Collecting bottles. Sweeping church steps. Fixing fences people didn't want to pay for properly. Returning shopping carts no one thanked me for. 8 months of being invisible. Dean closed his eyes briefly. Brent's throat tightened. Sir? I didn't mean. Frank lifted his hand slightly. I'm not offended, he said. I'm tired. That word carried more weight than any accusation could have. Dean rested both hands on the counter now, leaning forward just slightly, bringing himself down to the human level of the moment. Frank wasn't always invisible, he said. Several people inhaled at once. There was a time, Dean continued, when this man could walk into any room in this city and every voice would stop. Not because he was famous, because he was trusted. Now Brent's brow furrowed. Trusted. How? Dean looked at Frank again before answering. Frank Rivera was my road manager for 17 years. Before that, he handled bookings for half the acts that built this town's music scene. He negotiated contracts before agents had names for themselves. He protected young performers from bad deals, and older ones from bad habits. He once slept in a hallway chair for 3 nights straight so a singer wouldn't relapse alone. The room felt smaller now. Not cramped. Focused. When I had nothing, Dean said, his voice lowering, Frank fed me. When I had too much, Frank grounded me. When my father died, Frank was the one who stood behind me when I couldn't stand at all. Frank's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Dean turned back to Brent. So when you look at him, he said, you are not looking at a beggar. Brent's ears burned. You're looking at a man who gave his best years to making sure others could shine. Dean continued. And when the world moved on, he didn't complain. He adjusted. Dean reached into his coat pocket. The room seemed to hold its breath. He removed a slim leather folder and placed it on the counter. He did not open it. This, he said, is my personal account portfolio with this institution. It contains several of my long-term deposits, my charitable trust, and the emergency fund I established after Frank's wife passed away. Brent's eyes flicked to the folder as if it were radioactive. I'm here, Dean went on, to transfer all of it. A murmur moved through the bank like distant thunder. Into an account, Dean said. That bears Frank Rivera's name. Frank's head snapped up. Dean, not a gift, Dean said immediately. A correction. Brent stood now. He did not remember deciding to, Mr. Martin, I need to call my supervisor. Dean nodded. Please do. But before Brent could step away, Dean added, and while you're at it, find out whether this bank still remembers what its buildings are actually for. Brent paused. Dean gestured gently to the coins. Because money doesn't come from accounts, he said. It comes from people. Frank closed his hand over the pouch again. For the first time, his fingers trembled. I only wanted somewhere safe to put what I'd earned. He said quietly. Dean's voice softened. And you will, he said. But not before everyone here understands what it costs you. The supervisor arrived moments later, breathless, unaware that he was stepping into something far larger than customer relations. And as he approached, as he saw Dean Martin, as he noticed the coins, the folder, The silent crowd, he realized this was not a transaction. It was a reckoning. And somewhere deep inside, Brent Caldwell, something fragile and unfamiliar began to crack. Not fear, understanding. The bank no longer felt like a bank. It felt like a confession chamber. People had stopped checking their phones. The low mechanical hum of the counting machines in the back had faded into irrelevance. Even the polished marble floors seemed to have lost their authority, as if they understood that something older, heavier, and more human had entered the room and taken command. The supervisor stood frozen for half a breath after. Dean Martin finished speaking. He was a careful man, trained in crisis language and corporate posture. But no training prepared you for moments when money became secondary to meaning. "Mr. Martin," he said at last, forcing steadiness into his voice. "We can, of course, move to a private office." Dean looked around the bank. Then he shook his head. "No," he said gently. "Private is what made this happen." The supervisor followed his gaze, saw the coins, the people, the silence. He nodded once. "As you wish." Dean turned to Frank. "Would you mind," he asked softly, "if they knew who you were before they decide who you are now?" Frank's throat moved. His eyes drifted across the room. Faces, strangers, suits, dresses, all of them waiting. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Dean didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The room had already leaned forward. Frank rested both palms on the counter. The coins lay between them like small, stubborn stars. He looked at them not with embarrassment, but with something closer to respect. There was a time, he began. "When I handled more money in one afternoon than this bank sees in a week, several people shifted. I never owned it," he continued. "I moved it, protected it, negotiated it. I believed that made me important." His voice was steady, but age had roughened it. Not weakness. Texture. "I was the man behind the man," Frank said. "The one who fixed what fame broke. The one who took the late calls. The one who sat in hospital hallways and hotel stairwells and courtrooms at dawn. I was proud of that." Dean closed his eyes. "I watched men become legends," Frank went on. "And I watched legends become ghosts. And somewhere in the middle, I forgot to be anything else. A woman near the chairs pressed her hand to her mouth. Then my wife got sick," Frank said. The words changed the air. No warning. No slow fade. Just one doctor's voice, careful and kind, and completely useless. "Cancer doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care who you've helped." He paused. "Not for drama, for memory. I sold what I had. I called in favors I didn't want to use. I borrowed from men I had once protected. And when that ran out, I emptied what was left and pretended it was enough."
Oh.
Dean's jaw tightened. "She lived another year," Frank said. "Long enough to believe I'd saved her. Long enough to thank me for it. And when she went, everything I'd built went with her." Silence now was not polite. It was heavy. "I didn't fall," Frank said. "I stepped away. I didn't want sympathy. I didn't want charity. I wanted to know what I was without usefulness. Without access. Without being needed." He lifted one of the coins between his fingers. "So I started over where no one applauds, where no one owes you, where every dollar weighs something." Brent felt his chest tighten. He had not moved, had not breathed properly. Every sentence seemed aimed at a version of himself he hadn't known existed. "I learned what it's like to ask for work," Frank continued. "To be ignored. To be smiled at without being seen. I learned how people talk when they think you can't change anything." His eyes lifted. "That's how I know your words today weren't cruel," he said gently. Looking at Brent, they were comfortable. Brent's face drained of color. "You don't learn what a person believes when they're angry," Frank went on. "You learn it when they're relaxed." Dean placed his hand over Frank's. The supervisor swallowed. "Sir, why didn't you reach out?" he asked quietly. "Surely people would have helped," Frank smiled. "They would have saved me," he said. "I didn't want saving. I wanted earning. Dean looked at him then. Really looked. And now? He asked. Frank inhaled. Now I wanted a place, he said. That didn't look at the weight of the money before the weight of the work. Dean nodded slowly. Brent stepped forward without. Realizing he was moving, I was wrong, he said. The words came out rough. Frank turned to him. Didn't see you? Brent continued. I saw a problem. A delay. Something that didn't belong on my screen. He exhaled sharply. I thought professionalism meant distance. I didn't know it could mean dignity. Frank studied him. Do you know what the worst part of being invisible is? He asked. Brent shook his head. It isn't hunger, Frank said. It isn't cold. It's when you start believing you deserve it. Brent's eyes stung. I don't want to deposit this anymore, Frank said suddenly. The supervisor stiffened. Sir, Frank slid the pouch back toward himself. I want to open a new account, he said. For something else. Dean looked at him, surprised. For people who don't yet know what their work is worth, Frank continued. For the ones who are saving coins because they don't trust anyone with bills. A murmur moved through the room. I want this place, Frank said. To be where their money stops feeling small. Dean's breath left him slowly, and I want him, Frank added. Glancing at Brent, to help me build it, every head turned. Brent froze. Not as punishment, Frank said. As practice, Dean's eyes shone. The supervisor hesitated, then nodded once. We can discuss that. Dean finally smiled, and in that smile was not fame. It was gratitude, because the city had not just remembered Frank Rivera. Frank Rivera had decided to return. The glass doors of Golden State Trust Bank had never closed on a moment like this before. They closed on thieves, on fraud investigations, on quiet and everyday routines, where money was counted and lights were dimmed and human stories were filed away like paperwork. But today, when the manager finally turned the sign from open to closed, no one moved. Not Dean Martin, not Frank Rivera, not Brent Caldwell, and not the strangers, who had unknowingly walked into a reckoning because something had happened. In this building that had nothing to do with accounts and everything to do with mirrors. The manager cleared his throat gently. We'll keep the lobby open for those already inside, he said. We won't be taking new customers. No one objected. The outside world could wait. Frank sat now in one of the leather chairs near the window. Someone had offered it without asking, without instruction. He did not sit like a guest. He sat like a man who had finally allowed himself to be tired. The pouch of coins rested on the table beside him, not hidden, not displayed, just there. Dean remained standing. He had declined a chair he always had, not because he needed to stand, because he believed standing kept him honest. I didn't come here today just to move money, Dean said quietly to the small circle that had gathered around Frank. I came because I was afraid. The word surprised them. I was afraid, he repeated, that the man who taught me how to survive this world had been surviving it alone. Frank smiled faintly. You were busy teaching others how to sing. Dean shook his head. You taught me how to listen. Brent stood a few feet away, hands folded in front of him. Not like an employee, like a student. Dean turned toward him, Dean said. I've been called many things in my life. Most of them loud, most of them wrong. But the one I've been most grateful for is kind. Brent nodded. Uncertain, and kindness, Dean continued, isn't softness. It's accuracy. It's seeing what's actually in front of you, instead of what your habits tell you should be. He gestured gently toward Frank. You didn't see him, Dean said. You saw a category. Brent swallowed. Yes, and categories are comfortable, Dean said. They let us stop looking. Brent closed his eyes. When I was young, Dean went on, I thought success meant never needing anyone. Frank taught me it meant noticing when someone else did. Frank looked away, overcome. The manager approached quietly. Mr. Martin, he said, our board will want a statement about the new fund, about the account. Dean nodded. They'll have one. He turned to Frank. But only if you want it. Frank considered, then shook his head. I don't want my name on a door, he said. I want it in a practice. Dean smiled. Then we'll build one. The manager hesitated. Sir, the scale of what you're proposing community accounts, micro savings programs, personalized teller training, this is unprecedented for us. Dean met his eyes. So was recorded music once. The manager let out a breath that might have been a laugh. Frank shifted in his seat. There's something else, he said. Dean turned. Frank picked up the pouch. I don't want this deposited, he said. Not today. Brent looked up sharply. I want these coins to stay here, Frank continued. In this branch? The manager frowned slightly as a reminder, Frank said. He opened the pouch and began, slowly, deliberately, to line the coins across the edge of the desk. One for every morning I was ignored, he said quietly. One for every door that closed before I reached it. One for every person who decided what I was worth before I spoke. No one interrupted him. These aren't small, Frank said. They're heavy. They're earned. And they're the reason this place is about to change. He looked at Brent. And you're going to be the first person who touches every one of them, Frank said. Not to count them. Brent's brow creased. Then, to remember, Frank replied. Brent stepped forward. He did not hesitate. He knelt, and he began to pick up the coins, one by one, placing them carefully back into the pouch. Not fast, not efficiently, respectfully. Dean watched him, and for the first time since he had entered the bank, he felt certain he had arrived exactly where he was meant to. When the last coin was lifted, Frank tied the DRAWSTRNG. Then he handed the pouch to Brent. Tomorrow, Frank said, we start. Brent took it as if it were fragile. Outside, the sun had begun to lower, spilling amber light through the tall glass windows, bathing the room not in wealth, but in warmth. Dean reached into his jacket pocket once more. This time, he removed nothing. He simply placed his hand over his heart. Thank you, said, not to the bank, not to the people, to the man. Frank closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he felt rich.